All right. Salute to everybody. Salute. Let me set myself up here. Apparently, I unplugged my headphones. Top of the afternoon, everybody. Top of the afternoon. All right. We're back at it with the New Era Young Lord Book Club, also known as the AfroTaino Book Club. If this is your first time here, I do believe in socialism, free education, free housing, and free healthcare. So by tapping the screen and sharing this live, it's showing me a little bit of socialist love and support to be able to get the message out to the masses. We're going to pick up where we left off, guys. Yesterday, we started the Huey P. Newton Reader, and today we're actually going to continue off. We have about 11 hours and 49 minutes of the entire book. Saludo, top of the afternoon to everybody tapping in. So we're going to take it one step at a time, maybe about 2 hours this afternoon and a couple of hours, tomorrow, and so on and so forth. So salute to everybody. If you could do me a favor, we are live on YouTube and TikTok. So if you guys could shoot me a subscribe and a follow and be able to share the content to keep it pushing. Let's keep it going, guys. And please don't forget the Young Lords Back the Borinquen Project from October 5th to the 16th. We will be in Yabucoa, Puerto Rico at the Marco Sanchez Community Center. Marco Sanchez Community Center was a school that was closed down due to lack of funds and resources. So the community took it over to allocate it to community purposes and also emergency refuge for the community just in case hurricane or any other natural disaster occurs. So don't forget to check that out. GoFundMe link is in the bio on TikTok, and you can reach out to me personally, or you can even send to the Cash App at AfroTaino88. But without further ado, guys, because I don't want to keep you guys waiting any longer, let's jump straight into the book, finish off where we left off, and I forgot to put my phone on the charger, so I'm going to start this up. Let me plug up and let's get it going.
Sacramento and the Panther Bill. Bobby and I look back on the early days of the Black Panthers with nostalgia. It was a time of discovery and enthusiasm. We had hit on something unique. By standing up to the police as equals, even holding them off, and yet remaining within the law, we had demonstrated Black pride to the community in a concrete way. Everywhere we went, we caused traffic jams. People constantly stopped us to say how much they respected our courage. The idea of armed self-defense as a community policy was still new and a little intimidating to them, but it also made them think. More important, it created a feeling of solidarity. When we saw how Black citizens reacted to our movement, we were greatly encouraged. Despite the ever-present danger of retaliation, the risks were more than worth it. At that time, however, our activities were confined to a small area, and we wanted Black people throughout the country to know the Oakland story. In April 1967, we were invited to appear on a radio talk show in Oakland, the kind where people phone in questions and make comments. Early in the program, we explained our 10-point program, why we were focusing on point 7, and why it was necessary for Black men to arm themselves. We also made it clear that we were within our constitutional rights. Hundreds of calls poured in. The lines were jammed. Some people agreed with us, others disputed our points. We welcomed the discussion because criticism helped us to find weaknesses in our program and to sharpen our position. One of the callers was Donald Mulford, a conservative Republican state assemblyman from Piedmont, one of the wealthy white sections of Oakland. Mulford was so close to Oakland's power structure that his call could only mean he saw political profit in attacking the Black Panthers. He told us that he planned to introduce a bill into the state legislature to make it illegal for us to patrol with our weapons. It was a bill, he said, that would get the Black Panthers. Mulford's call was a logical response of the system. We knew how the system operated. If we used the laws in our own interest and against theirs, then the power structure would simply change the laws. Mulford was more than willing to be the agent of change. A few days later, the paper carried a story about Mulford's Panther Bill. In its particulars, it was what we had expected. A bill intended to suppress the people's constitutional right to bear arms. Until then, white men had owned and carried weapons with impunity. Groups like the Minutemen and the Rangers in Richmond were known to have arsenals, but nobody introduced bills against them. Mulford had been asked by the Oakland police to introduce this bill because some young black toughs, as they called us, were walking around with guns. The bill was further evidence of this country's vicious double standard against blacks. The usual pattern of white racism was gradually being put into effect. They would escalate the killing of blacks, but this time the police would do the job that the Ku Klux Klan had done in the past.
Listen up.
The Black Panthers have never viewed such paramilitary groups as the Ku Klux Klan or the Minutemen as particularly dangerous. The real danger comes from highly organized establishment forces, the local police, the National Guard, and the United States military. They were the ones who devastated Watts and killed innocent people. In comparison to them, the paramilitary groups are insignificant. In fact, these groups are hardly organized at all. It is the uniformed men who are dangerous and who come into our communities every day to commit violence against us, knowing that the laws will protect them. Bobby Seale and I discussed the Mulford bill against this background. Sheriff Younger had suggested facetiously that the Dowell family attempt to get their case heard at the state capitol. The Dowell family only wanted some good to come out of all the grief inflicted on them. We knew that the Dowells would get no better consideration in Sacramento than they had received from Younger. The legislators would probably tell them to go to the governor, and the governor would point to Washington. Institutions work this way.
Facts.
A son is murdered by the police and nothing is done. The institutions send the victim's family on a merry-go-round, going from one agency to another until they wear out and give up. This is a very effective way to beat down poor and oppressed people who do not have the time to prosecute their cases. Time is money to poor people. To go to Sacramento means loss of a day's pay, often loss of a job. If this is a democracy, obviously it is a bourgeois democracy limited to the middle and upper classes. Only they can afford to participate in it. Knowing all this, we nonetheless made plans to go to Sacramento. That we would not change any laws was irrelevant, and all of us, Black Panthers and Dowells, realized that from the start. Since we were resigned to a runaround in Sacramento, we decided to raise the encounter to a higher level in the hope of warning people about the dangers in the Mulford bill and the ideas behind it. A national outcry would help the Dowell family by showing them that some good had come from their tragedy. Also, it might mobilize our community even more. Dozens of reporters and photographers haunt the Capitol waiting for a story. This made it the perfect forum for our proclamation. If the legislators got the message too, well and good. But our primary purpose was to deliver it to the people. Actually, several groups went, 4 or 5 members of the Dowell family, a group of brothers from East Oakland, recruited by Mark Comfort, and the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers and Comfort's cadre were armed. The party agreed that I ought not to make the trip for 2 reasons. First, I was on probation from the Odell Lee case, and they did not want to jeopardize my freedom. Second, if any arrests were made in Sacramento, someone should be available to raise bail money and do whatever else was necessary. Before they left, I prepared Executive Mandate Number 1, which was to be our message to the black communities. It read, "The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense calls upon the American people in general, and black people in particular, to take careful note of the racist California legislature now considering legislation aimed at keeping black people disarmed and powerless while racist police agencies throughout the country intensify the terror, brutality, murder, and repression of black people. At the same time that the American government is waging a racist war of genocide in Vietnam, the concentration camps in which Japanese Americans were interned during World War II are being renovated and expanded. Since America has historically reserved its most barbaric treatment for non-white people, we are forced to conclude that these concentration camps are being prepared for black people who are determined to gain their freedom by any means necessary. The enslavement of black people at the very founding of this country, the genocide practiced of the American Indians on the confinement of the survivors on reservations, the savage lynching of thousands of black men and women, The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and now the cowardly massacre in Vietnam, all testify to the fact that toward people of color, the racist power structure of America has but one policy: repression, genocide, terror, and the big stick. Black people have begged, prayed, petitioned, and demonstrated, among other things, to get the racist power structure of America to right the wrongs which have historically been perpetrated against black people. All of these efforts have been answered by more repression, deceit, and hypocrisy.
Listen.
As the aggression of the racist American government escalates in Vietnam, the police agencies of America escalate the repression of black people throughout the ghettos of America. Vicious police dogs, cattle prods, and increased patrols have become familiar sights in black communities. City Hall turns a deaf ear to the pleas of black people for relief from this increasing terror. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense believes that the time has come for black people to arm themselves against this terror before it is too late. The pending Mulford Act brings the hour of doom one step nearer. A people who have suffered so much for so long at the hands of a racist society must draw the line somewhere. We believe that the black communities of America must rise up as one man to halt the progression of a trend that leads inevitably to their total destruction. When I gave Bobby his instructions, I impressed upon him that our main purpose was to deliver the message to the people. If he was fired upon, he should return the fire. If a gun was drawn on him and it was his interpretation that the gun was drawn in anger, he was to use whatever means necessary to defend himself.
Tap that screen, guys.
His instructions were not to fire or take the offensive unless in imminent danger. If they attempted to arrest him, he was to take the arrest as long as he had delivered the message. The main thing was to deliver the message. In stressing these points, I told him that if he was invited in or allowed inside the legislature, he was to read the message inside. But if it was against the rules to enter the legislature, or if measures were taken to block him, then he was not to enter, but to read the message from the Capitol steps. The Black Panther troops rolled out for Sacramento early on the morning of May 2nd. As soon as they left, I went to my mother's house. I had promised to mow her lawn that day, but I took a portable radio along and put it on the front step to listen for news. In the house, I turned the television set on and asked my mother to keep an eye on it. Then I started mowing. About noon, a bulletin interrupted the radio program. It told of brothers at the Capitol with weapons. My mother called out to me that all channels were showing the event. I ran into the house, and there was Bobby reading the mandate. The message was definitely going out. Bobby read it twice, but the press and the people assembled were so amazed at the Black Panthers' presence, and particularly the weapons, that few appeared to hear the important thing. They were concentrating on the weapons. We had hoped that after the weapons gained their attention, they would listen to the message. Later, another bulletin came on saying that the brothers had been arrested. Bobby for carrying a concealed weapon, although he was wearing his gun openly on his hip. Some of the other brothers were charged with failing to remove the rounds from the chambers of their guns when they put their weapons back in the car. I got on the phone and finally made contact with one of the Black Panther women who had gone along. She told me what had happened, and I began to initiate the next phase of our plan, raising bail money. That night I went to a local radio station where a talk show was on. People calling in to discuss the incident had been told that I was in jail, and I decided the best way to deal with that was by confrontation. So I went in there, as Malcolm would have done, and asked for equal airtime. One of the startled program directors looked at me and said, "Well, you're sort of in jail." I said, "Yes, I am in jail, but let me have equal time anyway." On the air, I explained the Sacramento ploy. My explanation was not very effective, I felt, because people who call these shows are always more interested in themselves than in issues, and you have to fight through that first.
Facts.
But I was able to make an appeal for money. We were faced with $50,000 bail in Sacramento, and within 24 hours, I had raised the $50,000 needed to get the troops back on the streets. Our plans had worked exactly as we hoped.
Listen up.
Looking back, I think our tactic at Sacramento was correct at that time, but it was also a mistake in a way. It was the first time in our brief existence that an armed group of Black Panthers had been arrested, and it was a turning point in police perceptions. We took the arrests because we had a higher purpose, but it was not until then that the police started attempting to disarm the party. They leveled shotguns on the brothers, handcuffed them, and generally pushed them around. I had given orders not to fire unless fired upon. Maybe the order should have been to fire on everybody in there. Then they would have realized we were serious. But our purpose was not to kill. It was to inform, to let the nation know where the party stood. The police, however, took it to mean that the party was only a front with weapons, that we would not defend ourselves. This attitude caused a number of problems for us. It took some time to restore caution to the police after Sacramento. Now everything is as it used to be, because they know they will have a fight on their hands if they try to attack us. Sacramento was certainly a success, however, in attracting national attention. Even those who did not hear the complete message saw the arms, and this conveyed enough to Black people. The Bay Area became more aware of the party, and soon we had more members than we could handle. From all across the country, calls came to us about establishing chapters and branches. We could hardly keep track of the requests. In a matter of months, we went from a small Bay Area group to a national organization, and we began moving to implement our 10-point program.
You see how you kind of get a different perception even of the Panthers once you start understanding the reasoning behind their actions, and even to the lengths that they actually took their actions versus what the media and the propaganda and what the system wants to portray these organizations to actually be in the eyes of the public, right? When we talk about domestic tea groups and all of that, you got to also understand it is also the propaganda behind it. We got to actually dig into the ideologies, philosophies, and the reasons why these organizations did what they did. And this is why I said there's a huge misconception of the Panthers, even of the Young Lords and the Brown Berets, like they just some gunslinging, wild individuals out there. And it's not even like that. For every action is an opposite and equal reaction. They're just trying to prove a point. Even with this whole book, man. And this is why I say people glorify the Panthers and they glorify, ideology and philosophy. But I don't even think individuals really know the individuals that they claim they follow and all of that. Like he even told you, we study different philosophies and ideologies, but he can't take, Mao's lessons word for word or verbatim to be able to apply it to the Black community. It's not the same situation, not same circumstances, but it's to take what you need and leave the rest. And he talks about this about several revolutionaries and philosophers, which I agree with it 100%. We got to be able to take what we need out of a lot of lessons that already went through and things in history that already happened, right? And be able to apply the proper components that were successful, right, into a new modernized version of whatever these philosophies and ideologies are. And unfortunately, yeah, that goes for China too. Salute to my brother TikToxic down there, brother. Salute to you. And I threw that China in there because that's my brother down there. Me and him go back and forth on a lot of China and I guess whatever side he decides to put me on, whatever day of the week it is, because my man be wild. But salute to everybody. Yo, guys, really quick, before we go on to the next chapter, we are live on YouTube. So if you guys want to hop over to YouTube and go hit a subscribe, or if you guys missed some of the book yesterday and you want to be able to catch up on some of the stuff you missed, it is up on YouTube, AfroTaino 88, the same way it is here on TikTok. So for everybody on TikTok, do me a favor, shoot over to YouTube, go hit subscribe, follow. If you want to come back on this platform to watch me, salute to that too. But go show me some love and let's shake up both algorithms, guys, so we can be able to get the message out to the masses. Like I said, I do believe in socialism, free housing, free education, and free healthcare. So by tapping the screen, sharing these lives is helping me get a little bit of social love and support to be able to get the message out to everybody. Let's get it going, guys.
Crisis, October 28, 1967. When I was convicted of assaulting Odell Lee in 1964, the court sentenced me to 3 years probation under condition that I first serve 6 months in the county jail. After release, I reported regularly to my probation officer, all through the months that we founded the Black Panther Party and began our work in the community. The probation officer was better than average, really a pretty nice guy, intelligent and fair, and we got along well. Nonetheless, I was relieved when he told me early in October 1967 that my probation would end on October 27 and parole would begin. One of the requirements of parole was that I avoid some parts of Berkeley. In any case, no more reporting. October 27 was going to be a very special day, and my girlfriend, Laverne Williams, and I agreed that we would celebrate the occasion. On the afternoon of October 27, I was scheduled to speak at a forum on the future of the Black Liberation Movement, sponsored by the Black Students Union of San Francisco State College. Requests for speaking engagements had been coming in frequently since the end of the summer.
Let's tap it up, guys.
The Sacramento publicity prompted a number of college groups to ask for an explanation of our approach to the problems of blacks. They were also interested in hearing why we opposed spontaneous rebellions in black communities and how we viewed the recent riots in Newark and Detroit. Bobby was in jail, and I was filling as many of these requests as possible, even though I am not very good at talking to large groups, nor do I enjoy it. Abstract and theoretical ideas interest me most, but they lack the...
Yo, really quick, for people to understand who are just coming in, or this is the first time you guys are coming across the Huey P. These are his writings, this is his words, you know, this is he's telling you his story. This is a collection of his personal stories and things that he went through in diaries and personal writings and anecdotes. Like, this is all of his stuff. So guys, really pay attention to when he's speaking, because sometimes individuals want to create narratives for some of our revolutionary leaders, but when they speak, we don't fully listen.
Fire to hold audiences. I went to San Francisco State anyway because I was eager to increase our contacts with black college students. Sharing the platform with me that afternoon was Dr. Harry Edwards, the sociology professor from San Jose State College, who is organizing the Olympic boycott by black athletes. That session was particularly challenging because it offered the opportunity for a lively discussion with people who disagreed with my ideas. This was in 1967, just after one of the longest, hottest summers in American history. Student consciousness had never been higher. I talked about the necessity for black people to gain control of the institutions in their own communities, eventually transforming them into cooperatives, and of one day working with other ethnic groups to change the system. When I had finished speaking, an informal dialogue began. Almost all the students' questions and criticisms were directed at the Black Panthers' willingness to work in coalition with white groups. We maintained this was possible as long as we controlled the programs, but the students were opposed to working with white groups, or for that matter, almost anyone but blacks. While this viewpoint was understandable to me, it failed to take into consideration the limitations of our power. We needed allies, and we believed that alliances with young whites, students and workers, were worth the risk.
Tap the screen, tap the screen.
I pointed out that many young whites had suddenly discovered hypocrisy. Their fathers and forefathers had written and talked brotherhood and democracy while practicing greed, imperialism, and racism. While speaking of the rights of mankind and equality for all, of free enterprise, the profit system, of individualism, and healthy competition, they had plundered the wealth of the world and enslaved blacks in the United States. White youths now saw through this hypocrisy and were trying to bring about changes through traditional electoral politics. But reality is impervious to idealism. These youngsters were discovering what blacks knew in their bones, that the military-industrial complex was practically invincible and had in fact created a police state, which rendered idealism powerless to change anything. This led to disillusionment with their parents and the American power structure. At that point of disillusionment, they began to identify with the oppressed people of the world. When the Black Panthers saw this trend developing, we understood that their dissatisfaction could help our cause. In a few years' time, almost half of the American population would be composed of young people. If we developed strong and meaningful alliances with white youth, they would support our goals and work against the establishment.
And this is why it confuses me, even today, organizing with the Young Lords, when people try to tell me from the Puerto Rican community that claim they studied the philosophies and ideologies of the Young Lords and the Panthers, and they want to tell me, oh, we shouldn't have, white tea folks within our, movement, within this and within that. And I'm like, yo, dog, like, did you really, like, go study? Did you really understand the lessons, the teachings? Like, do you understand the concept? Ain't nobody free until all of us are free. This is why during the 60s, everything was so successful. Not everything, but a lot of things were successful, and we got massive change that we benefit today because our elders, our leaders, our founding fathers of the movements understood the importance of international struggle. They understood the intersectionalities between their struggles, not just the similarities of the things that they go through, but the nations, the colonial powers that crossed their paths, that did the same thing to you, that did the same thing to me, that did the same thing to the other person over there, and so on and so forth. This is what is the success of a lot of these revolutionary movements from the beginning of time. Because if you study every revolution, it doesn't matter what revolution you study, you will see the help and participation of other oppressed people to see the success of someone else to be able to come back and trickle back to be able to help the other nation to come out of. So this is why I said we got to have a better understanding. Let's keep tapping that screen. Let's keep sharing this live, and let's keep it going.
Everywhere I went in 1967, I was vehemently attacked by black students for this position. Few could present opposing objective evidence to support their criticisms. The reaction was emotional.
And mind you, I don't believe at this point they haven't started the first Rainbow Coalition. They haven't started. So the same pushback that Huey got is the same exact pushback that Fred Hampton got. And if you understand the assassination of Fred Hampton, you would understand why was he such a detrimental pain in the ass for the FBI and the United States government. Because you can have that much influence over individuals and that much, power to be able to bring people together of all oppressed classes to go against the system. You can make massive, massive change within the system. I'm just saying.
White people were devils. They wanted nothing to do with them. I agreed that some white people could act like devils, but we could not blind ourselves to a common humanity. More important was how to control the situation at our advantage. These questions would not be answered overnight or in a decade, and time and again, the students and I went for hours getting nowhere. We talked right past each other. The racism that dominated their lives had come between us, and rational analysis was the victim. When I left San Francisco that afternoon, I reflected that many of the students who were supposedly learning how to analyze and understand phenomena were in fact caught up in the same predicament as the prisoners in Plato's cave allegory. Even though they were in college, they were still prisoners in the cave of exploitation and racism that black people have been subjected to for centuries. Far from preparing them to deal with reality, college kept their intellects in chains. That afternoon, I felt even more strongly that the party would have to develop a program to implement point 5 of our program, a true education for our people. When I returned home around 6:30, I had a happy, righteous dinner of mustard greens and cornbread with my family. We discussed the college students and their attitudes and how difficult it had been to get through to them. That was our last meal together as a family for 33 months. But I had no premonition of this when I left the house and set out on foot for Laverne's. The friends with me at San Francisco State had taken the car after driving me home. On the way, I planned our evening together and thought about some of the things I might do now that I no longer had to report to my probation officer. At Laverne's house, I found to my disappointment that she was ill and did not feel like going out. Although I wanted to stay with her, she insisted that I take her car and celebrate. She knew how much it meant to me that probation was over. By this time, it was getting late, close to 10, so I decided to visit a few of my favorite places. Nothing about my movements that evening was out of the ordinary. I went first to the Boston's Locker, the bar where I had started recruiting. Most of the people there were close or casual friends, and I talked, discussing my new freedom and celebrating with a liberation drink, Cuba Libre. a rum and coke. From there, I went to a nearby church where a social was in full swing. Every Wednesday night, this church held an Afro history class, and on Friday nights, a well-attended social with dancing and punch. I had one more place to go, a party being given by friends on San Pablo Street in Oakland. About 2 a.m., when the social was ending, I set out for the party with Gene McKinney, a friend I had known since grammar school. By now, it was October 28. I was officially a free man and feeling great. Even though the food was gone by the time we got to San Pablo Street, I did not mind. It was good to mingle with the people and talk about the Black Panthers and answer their questions. We stayed until the very end, 4 a.m. Then Gene McKinney and I headed for 7th Street, the center of the action for West Oakland. There are a number of bars and soul food restaurants on the street, a few nightclubs, and at almost any hour you can find something going on. Some of the restaurants serve up barbecue that is really saying something. Gene and I were hungry, and 7th Street is the place to get righteous soul food. As I turned into 7th Street, looking for a parking place, I saw the red light of a police car in my rear view mirror. I had not realized that I was being trailed by policemen, and my initial reaction was, here we go again, more harassment. But, having been stopped so many times before, I was ready. The police had a list of the licenses on cars Black Panthers frequently used, so we always expected this. I kept my law book between the bucket seats, and I knew that once I began to read the law to the law enforcer, he would have to let me go. I wondered what his excuse would be this time. I had obeyed all the traffic regulations. I pulled the car over to the curb, and the police officer stopped behind me, remaining in his car for a minute or so. Then he got out and came up to my window. When he got a good look at me, he stuck his head in the window within 6 inches of my face and said very sarcastically, "Well, well, well, what do we have here? The great, great Huey P. Newton."
Tap the screen, tap the
I made
screen.
no reply, but merely looked him in the eye. He acted like a fisherman who had just landed a prize catch he had never dreamed of landing. Then he asked for my driver's license, which I gave to him. "Who does the car belong to?" he asked. I told him, "It belongs to Miss Laverne Williams," and showed him the registration.
Really quick, everybody tapping in on TikTok. We are also live on YouTube. We're dual live. So if you guys missed any of the beginning parts of this book or interested in any other books, or just want to be able to recap some of the stuff we go over on my lives, you can go find me on AfroTaino 88. Shoot me a subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bells. And everybody watching on YouTube, go hit the follow over there on TikTok and go follow me at AfroTaino 88. But salute to everybody participating. I appreciate all the love and support. And do me a favor in the comments section, keep the identity politics out of here. It's weird. I'm not gonna lie to you.
Comparing it with the license, he gave me the license back and went to his car with the registration. While I sat in the car waiting for him to finish, another police officer pulled up behind the first one. This was not unusual, and I attached little significance to it. The second officer walked up to the first officer's car, and they talked for a moment. Then the second officer came to my window and said, "Mr. Williams, do you have any further identification?" I said, "What do you mean, Mr. Williams? My name is Huey P. Newton, and I've already shown my driver's license to the first officer." He just looked at me, nodding his head, and said, "Yes, I know who you are." I knew they both recognized me because my picture and name were known to every officer in Oakland, as were Bobby's and most of the other Black Panthers. The first officer then came back to my car, opened the door, and ordered me out, while the second officer walked around to the passenger side and told Gene McKinney to get out. He then walked Gene to the street side of the car. Meanwhile, I picked up my law book from between the seats and started to get out. I thought it was my criminal evidence book, which covers laws dealing with reasonable cause for arrest and the search and seizure laws. If necessary, I intended to read the law to this policeman, as I had done so many times in the past. However, I had mistakenly picked up my criminal law book, which looks exactly like the other one. I got out of the car with the book in my right hand and asked the officer if I was under arrest. He said, "No, you're not under arrest. Just lean on the car." I leaned on the top of the car, a Volkswagen, with both hands on the law book while the officer searched me. He did it in a manner intended to be degrading, pulling out my shirt tail, running his hand over my body, and then he pat-searched my legs, bringing his hands up into my genital area. He was both disgusting and thorough. All this time, the four of us were in the street, the second officer with Gene McKinney. I could not see what they were doing. The officer then told me to go back to his car because he wanted to talk to me. Taking my left arm in his right hand, he began walking, or rather pushing me toward his car. But when we reached it, he kept going until we had reached the back door of the second police car, where he brought me to an abrupt halt. At this, I opened my law book and said, "You have no reasonable cause to arrest me." The officer was to my left, just slightly behind me. As I was opening the book, he snarled, "You can take that book and shove it up your ass, nigger." With that, he stepped slightly in front of me and brought his left hand up into my face, hooking me with a smear that was not a direct blow, but more like a solid straight arm. This momentarily dazed me, and I stumbled back 4 or 5 feet and went down on one knee, still holding on to my book. As I started to rise, I saw the officer draw his service revolver, point it at me, and fire. My stomach seemed to explode, as if someone had poured a pot of boiling soup all over me, and the world went hazy. There were some shots, a rapid volley, but I have no idea where they came from. They seemed to be all around me. I vaguely remember being on my hands and knees on the ground, disoriented, with everything spinning. I also had the sensation of being moved or propelled. After that, I remember nothing.
Going into the next chapter. Yo, salute to everybody tapping in on YouTube and TikTok. Much blessings to you guys, and thank you for the love and support. Let's keep it a safe and positive space. Everybody keep tapping the screen, keep sharing this live. And listen, if you see people in here long enough that you can resonate with them, go follow them. This is how we build community, right? So tap that screen, share this live, and let's keep it going. Trial part 1, let's get to it. It's an hour and 12 minutes, this one. This is going to be a little lengthy one. Get your pens and pad, write your notes. Let's get to it.
Trial. The morning my trial began on July 15, 1968, in the Alameda County Courthouse, 5,000 demonstrators and about 450 Black Panthers gathered outside to show their support.
450. Woo!
Loads of demonstrators came from out of town and joined the throng that crowded the streets and sidewalks outside the courthouse. Across the street from the building, a formation of Black Panthers stood, lined up 2 deep and stretching for a solid block. At the entrance to the building, a unit of sisters from the party chanted, "Free Huey" and "Set our warrior free." In front of them, on both sides of the courthouse door, 2 party members held aloft the blue Black Panther banner with "Free Huey" emblazoned on it. Black Panther security patrols with walkie-talkie radio sets ringed the courthouse. The building was under heavy guard. At every entrance and patrolling every floor, armed deputies from the sheriff's office prowled up and down, and plainclothes men were assigned positions throughout the building. On that first day, nearly 50 helmeted Oakland police stood inside the main entrance, and on the rooftop, more cops with high-powered rifles stared down into the street. The trial was conducted in the 7th-floor courtroom, a small, depressing room kept ice-cold throughout the trial. Security was so tight that the courtroom was carefully inspected before every session. Everyone, even my parents, was searched before entering. The spectators section had only about 60 seats. 2 rows were reserved for my family. The press had 25 or so seats, and the rest was for the general public. Every morning around dawn, people began lining up outside for the few remaining places. Presiding was Superior Court Judge Monroe Friedman, 72 years old, dour, and humorless. Of course, no one admits prejudice, but Judge Friedman betrayed his in countless ways throughout the trial. Clearly, from the beginning, he thought I was guilty, and his sympathies lay with the prosecution. For one thing, he condescended to black witnesses, speaking to them as if they were not capable of understanding the issues. It was obvious that he was totally unaware of the development of black consciousness in the past decade. Even his tone of voice was revealing. As the trial progressed, he constantly overruled my lawyer and sustained almost every objection of the prosecutor. Sometimes, when he did not like the way things were going, he looked over to the prosecutor's table as if inviting an objection, which he would then sustain. On interpretation, he was extremely rigid. Whenever a legal point could not be solved by legal mechanics, he would pass it off as unimportant, thereby leaving it for some higher court to deal with, or for some political statement to be made through the legislature. Nothing was considered that was not in the book. He acknowledged that some laws were good and reluctantly followed those he disliked. Never for one moment did I consider him a fair arbitrator. The most crucial aspect of the trial was the jury selection, and on that first trial day, several hundred prospective jurors came to the courthouse. Charles Gary wanted a certain kind of juror, and he faced terrific odds in finding him. For one thing, everyone in the Oakland area had read or seen prejudicial accounts of the shooting. It was difficult to find anyone without an opinion about the case. Then, too, we wanted some black people. This was a vital issue and, as we learned through our investigations, a formidable hurdle to overcome. Our inquiries revealed that the assistant district attorney and prosecutor in my trial, Lowell Jensen, had developed a system whereby blacks would ostensibly be on jury panels called for duty, but would always be eliminated before they were seated in an actual trial.
Listen up.
Under Jensen's direction, whenever a black was removed from a prospective jury for cause or through peremptory challenges, he was then returned to the jury panel and called in another trial. That way, it always appeared the blacks were an active part of the system, even though it was unlikely a black would ever serve on an actual jury. When my trial began, the routine changed. Other district attorneys in the area did not remove blacks from their jury panels. Therefore, while my trial was in session, there were juries in other courts with as many as 6 blacks on them. The party instructed Gary to use all his peremptory challenges on prospective jurors.
You see
that? In a
that?
capital case in the state of California, each side is allowed 20. That is, both defense and prosecution can reject 20 jurors without giving a reason. We gave Gary these instructions to demonstrate to the people that something is wrong with a trial system that defies the right of a defendant to be tried by a true cross-section of his community. We used all our peremptory challenges to emphasize this point. The prosecution did not exhaust all theirs, since it was not hard for them to find their kind of people. Charles Gary found racism in almost every prospective juror he questioned. Selecting the jury took a long time, about 2 weeks. All in all, 3 panels of prospective jurors, about 180 people, were questioned before a jury and 4 alternates were chosen. Out of the nearly 200 people available for my jury, there were 16 blacks, a few Orientals, and 1 or 2 Chicanos. The population of Oakland was then 38% black. The final jury consisted of 11 whites and 1 black. The black man, David Harper, actually looked enough like me to pass as a relative, although we were strangers before the trial. At the time, he was an executive in a branch of the Bank of America, but he has since become president of a black bank in Detroit. I wondered why the district attorney did not excuse him from serving. Perhaps he figured it would help his case in the appeals court to have at least 1 black on the jury. Also, he had tried to get a safe one. I figured that the district attorney saw Harper as a house nigger, a black bank official who had it made, so to speak. They probably thought Harper could be counted on because of his status and his ambition to go further in the white world. Throughout the trial, I studied Harper, trying to get the measure of the man. Would he go along with the madness of the system? With a jury, it is always a guessing game. You know the judge and the prosecutor are your enemies and will do anything to keep you down. Every other paid employee in the courtroom, regardless of his color, is a slave to the system. But the jurors are something else. I watched every move Harper made, yet I could not detect where he was or where he was going. I began to wonder if the fact that he had a good job in a bank gave him satisfaction. I asked myself whether he was so blinded by the crumbs the system offered him that he would go along with the racists on the jury and a corrupt state apparatus to secure his future, or what he hoped might be his future. These questions went through my mind almost daily as the proceedings crept along. Sometimes, pondering Harper, I found myself paying no attention at all to the boring testimony of the prosecution witnesses, such as the ballistics experts. Not until I took the stand myself and began talking to the jury did I feel Harper knew his friends better than the district attorney had estimated. When I finally testified, I directed my words to Harper. He was my audience. An unspoken bond grew up between us that convinced me he not only understood, but he also agreed with me. Only then did I see a glimmer of hope with the jury. He was it. However, I never placed much confidence in his ability to sway the others. The prosecutor in my case was Lowell Jensen, who later became district attorney of Alameda County. Jensen is a witty and intelligent man and a worthy opponent as far as the law is concerned. He appears to have a photographic memory, and on the basis of legal knowledge alone, he is a good lawyer. In my case, he meant to get a conviction of first-degree murder, no matter how far he had to stretch the law, and to that end, he ignored the possibility that there were a number of grounds for reversal, and that in time a higher court would decide against the verdict of this trial. A conviction was all he cared about. He knew that if he won his case against me, a person hated by the establishment, he would be rewarded with fame and rising fortune. What would a reversal matter? A ruling by a higher court would take from 2 to 5 years, and by that time he would have achieved what he wanted. My trial was nothing more than an ego trip for him. Throughout the trial, an unspoken game or challenge went on in the courtroom between Jensen, the judge, and myself, although a lot of people, especially the jury, knew nothing about it. The jury probably believed that the prosecutor and the judge were honorable men with only their jobs and justice on their minds. But my lawyers and I understood the undercurrents and intangibles that were always present, difficult as they were to expose. And we knew that if the jury were aware of them also, they would see the political nature of much that went on in the courtroom. For example, we surmised from the very start of the trial that Jensen had engineered the racist system by which blacks would be on jury panels called for duty, but eliminated before they could be seated for trial.
Right.
And we knew that Jensen did not have justice on his mind, but wanted victory at any cost to further his own personal ambitions. These were some of the things that made the whole trial seem like a grim game with my life at stake, but a game nonetheless. In his opening statement to the jury, Jensen charged that I had murdered Officer John Frey with full intent, that I had shot Officer Herbert Hines, and that I had kidnapped Del Ross. He said that when the first policeman stopped me, I had given him false identification, but when the second officer came up, I had correctly identified myself. Then the first officer, Frey, placed me under arrest. He claimed that when the police officer walked me back to his car, I produced a gun and began firing. According to Jensen, I shot Officer Frey with my own gun, which I pulled from inside my shirt, then took his gun and continued shooting. I was charged with shooting Officer Frey 5 times and Officer Hines 3 times. Officer Hines was supposed to have shot me once. After this, the prosecutor said, I escaped and forced Del Ross to take me to another part of Oakland. The most crucial challenge facing the prosecution was to establish motivation for my alleged actions. Jensen claimed that I had 3 motives for my alleged crimes. First, he said, I had had a prior conviction for a felony and was on probation. Because of this, I knew that having a concealed weapon on my person could lead to another felony conviction if the police officers found the gun on me. Second, they claimed that I had marijuana in the car and that bits of marijuana had been found in the pocket of my pants. This, too, could lead to another felony beef. And third, they claimed that I had given false identification to the police officer, which was a violation of the law. For these reasons, the prosecutor claimed I was so desperate to escape another felony charge that I killed an officer, wounded another, and kidnapped a citizen. As I said before, the prosecutor was willing to go to any lengths to win his case. The truth of the matter is that when Frey stopped me, he knew full well who I was, as did every other policeman on the Oakland force, and he tried to execute me in an urban variation of the old-style Southern lynching. My attorneys had investigated Frey's background, and they found a long history of harassing and mistreating black people and making racist statements about blacks and to blacks. Unfortunately for Frey, his habits boomeranged that time. I do not know what happened because I was unconscious, but things did not work out as he wanted or expected them to. I guess he thought if he could bring me in dead, he would be given a promotion. The marijuana charge was sheer fabrication. First of all, no member of the Black Panther Party uses drugs. It is absolutely forbidden. Anyone discovered violating this rule is expelled from the party. Narcotics prohibition is part of the Black Panther principle of obeying the law to the letter. Both Charles Gary and I believed that the marijuana found in the car and in my trousers was planted there by the police. Having been stopped by members of the Oakland police force more than 50 times in the past year, why would I take the risk? Knowing that at any moment of the day or night I was liable to be thoroughly searched and my car inspected, I would never have been reckless enough to carry marijuana, even if I had wanted to use it, which I didn't. If the matchboxes really were in Laverne's car that night...
Yo, really quick, everybody on TikTok, if you guys could do me a favor, go follow me on YouTube and go subscribe. I just got hit with 2 violations, so I might be getting kicked off pretty soon. Again, they don't like books or content like this brought onto TikTok platform, and this is where I grow my platform at. So if you guys could do me a favor, jump over to YouTube just in case I get clipped, so that way you could continue listening to the book. I would appreciate all the love and support. Keep tapping the screen. Keep the F1s locked and loaded, because like I just said, I got 2 what they called restrictions just now. So keep tapping it up. Let's keep it going. Let's keep this a safe and positive space. I don't know what's up with TikTok. It's definitely not a place I would consider all the time for educational purposes, but more drama and other bullshit that they allow on this platform, which is crazy. Again, this is why I am also on YouTube. So if you guys could shoot over to YouTube, go follow, subscribe, hit the notification bells, and tap in.
No way of knowing how they got there. Dozens of people used her car, many of whom she knew only slightly, since they were friends of friends. But it is far more likely that the police were behaving as usual, leaving out no possibility in their determination to railroad me to jail. As for being a felon with a gun, I, of course, was not carrying a weapon, but had been out celebrating the end of my probation that night. There was no reason for me to have a gun and no reason to avoid arrest on this count. Nor did I consider myself a felon. The original conviction of felony was a complicated one anyway, going back to the Odell Lee case in 1964. Under California law, the sentence a defendant receives determines whether he is a felon or a misdemeanant. If he is sentenced to a state prison, he is a felon. A misdemeanant usually goes to a county jail. When I was convicted of assaulting Odell Lee with a deadly weapon, I was sentenced to 3 years probation, a condition being that I served 6 months in a county jail. This meant I was a misdemeanant. However, in my murder trial, the judge testified that I had been sentenced to the state prison and that then the sentence had been suspended. As a condition of my probation, I spent 6 months in the county jail. Technically, the state considered me a felon. In the end, this proved to be reversible error. Although I could have changed my legal status in the courts, I never petitioned because I did not consider myself a felon. But the prosecution did, and planned its whole case around the point. Not only did they want to show I would commit murder to avoid arrest, but they also wanted to take advantage of the fact that a felon's testimony can be discredited and he can receive a severer sentence. Despite Charles Gary's objections and arguments, Judge Friedman ruled that I had been convicted of a felony in 1964, and this charge against me was added to the other three. This question of the Old LE conviction came up repeatedly during the trial, since the prosecution needed to establish a motive. Eventually, when I testified, I told the jury again that I had not considered myself a felon. It was actually a ridiculous basis for motivation, since I had dozens of witnesses who saw me out celebrating on the night of October 27, a fact which proved beyond doubt that I had no reason to resist arrest as a felon. When my trial was just beginning, Eldridge Cleaver put out a leaflet that was widely distributed in the black community. In it, he charged that the police, with murder on their minds, had violated the territorial integrity of the black community, and that I had dealt with their transgression in a necessary way. The leaflet went on to say that black people are justified in killing all policemen who do this. Behind Eldridge's message lay the inference that I had killed the police officer, even though I had not. The leaflet could not have been used against me in the courts. Even so, my family was very upset over it, and they protested strongly to Eldridge. They felt he cared little about me, and that he was in effect trying to gas me. I told them as gently as I could not to interfere with anything Eldridge or other party members did during the trial, because such actions could not be brought into the legal proceedings. As far as I was concerned, Eldridge was free to write and mobilize the community by any means necessary. I supported him in that. Issuing the leaflet was a political act using the trial to heighten the consciousness of the community. I was willing to go along with party actions in the interest of educating the people, mobilizing the community, and taking the contradictions to a higher level. After that, my family did not interfere with political activities. The trial caused much grief and worry to my family. They wanted to save me, but I felt death was ahead, and my main concern was the community. Because my family continued to hope, I could not tell them this, however, and I was very moved by their faith and support. In fact, the only strain I felt during the trial was the pull between trying to comfort my family and carrying out the political activities I knew were necessary. It has all worked out for the best now, but at the time, it was a tremendous weight on my family and on me. Another matter of concern was whether to reveal to my attorneys the name of Gene McKinney, my passenger on the night the incident went down. Gene had never been apprehended by the police, despite a diligent search. What is more, they did not even know his name. From the start, the police had cleared Gene, and Haynes had testified before the grand jury that my companion had not taken part in any violence. Right after I was captured, the police sent broadcasts all through California saying that they had apprehended the guilty party and they wanted the passenger to come in for questioning. They repeatedly said in these broadcasts that the passenger had nothing to do with the incident. I suspected that they wanted to use him against me, and at first I refused to give his name to my attorneys. I saw no point in involving Gene, even though I knew his testimony might help free me. Only when my lawyers had convinced me that legally the prosecution could not do anything to him did I agree to reveal Gene's identity. From my own knowledge of the law, I became aware that the courts were powerless to hurt him. However, Gene was skeptical. When my lawyers finally met him, they explained very carefully that he could not be hurt by testifying for the defense, and he did eventually testify despite his doubts. This showed supreme courage on his part, because the prosecutors were not above pulling some trick to involve him. The prosecution took about 3 weeks to present its case and called about 20 witnesses to the stand. They included people like the nurse who had admitted me at Kaiser Hospital, the doctor who did the autopsy on Officer Frey, ballistics experts from the police department, various policemen who arrived at the scene of the shooting, and so on. But their three most important witnesses were Patrolman Haynes, Henry Greer, the bus driver who allegedly witnessed the shooting, and Del Ross, who claimed that McKinney and I had kidnapped him. The first of these to testify was Herbert Haynes. When Officer Haynes took the witness stand, it soon became apparent that he was a very disturbed man. He told of recurring dreams in which the Black Panthers were attacking him. Haynes is not very bright, and as time and again he had trouble keeping his stories straight, the impression grew that he was completely confused. The prosecutor had obviously rehearsed him, but Haynes was so tense that he made mistakes. With each mistake, he dropped his head as if to say, "I'll try the script over again." He was no good at all at improvisation and reconciling contradictions in his testimony. Haynes testified that after Frey ordered me out of my car, the two of us walked to Haynes's patrol car, parked behind Laverne's Volkswagen, while he, Haynes, remained near the front door of Frey's patrol car, about 35 feet away from us. As Frey and I reached the rear of Haynes's car, Haynes testified that I turned around and started shooting, and that Frey and I then started to tussle on the trunk of his car. At this point, Haynes said he was shot in the right arm, whereupon he switched his gun to his left hand. Immediately after this, he noticed out of the corner of his eye that the passenger in my car, McKinney, had gotten out of the Volkswagen and was standing on the curb with his arms up in the air. Haynes turned his gun on him, but after the passenger assured him he was not armed, Haynes turned back to Frey and me. By this time, Haynes said, Frey and I had separated, although Frey was still hanging on to me, and he, Haynes, shot at my stomach as I faced him. He did not say that he saw his bullet hit me, only that he fired at my midsection. After that, Haynes said he remembered only two things. First, sending out a 940B, the police emergency number, over the police radio, and second, seeing two men running into the darkness. When Gary cross-examined Haynes after his testimony, many contradictions and unanswered questions emerged. Haynes repeatedly stated that he never saw a gun in my hand, yet he testified that I had turned around and started to shoot. He was never able to say who had shot him in the arm, although when he shot me in the stomach, he said I was facing him. He would not state that I had shot him, even though as a police officer, he is supposedly trained to observe such facts as whether or not a suspect has a gun. He was confused in his descriptions of what McKinney was wearing. Some of his testimony contradicted the description given later by Henry Greer, the bus driver. Perhaps the greatest weakness of his testimony, which Gary skillfully brought to the jury's attention, was that Haynes had turned his back on McKinney, having only McKinney's word that he was unarmed. Since the Oakland police distrusted and hated all Black Panthers, and since McKinney, who was unknown to Haynes, and who was riding with the Black Panther Minister of Defense, could very well have been a Black Panther, why had he left himself so unprotected? Particularly since he said he did not know where all the shots were coming from. As Gary suggested in his cross-examination of Haynes, it was probably because Haynes was more worried about what Frey would do. Among the police, Frey was known to need watching in the Black community. He was even worse than the normal cop, which made him extremely dangerous. It was clear from Haynes's testimony and the way he had been coached by the prosecutor that great pains had been taken to avoid any implication that Frey and Haynes had shot each other. Charles Gary's first question on cross-examination dealt with this. "Did you shoot and kill Officer Frey?" Haynes said no. Yet several facts pointed that way, and Haynes's evasions were not helpful to the prosecution. For instance, Haynes made a point of saying that he fired at me only when Frey and I had broken apart after our struggle on the car. A more damaging piece of evidence came from the ballistics section of the police department itself. The expert who testified concluded that the bullets that had hit both Frey and Haynes came from police revolvers. They were lead bullets, not copper-jacketed, as were the two 9mm casings found on the ground at the scene of the shooting. This damaged the prosecution's case, because Jensen had maintained from the beginning that I had shot Haynes and Frey with my own .38 pistol, whose bullets would have matched the 9mm casings found on the ground. Of course, this mythical gun was never found. All in all, Haynes's testimony did little for the prosecution. He became even more muddled during my second trial, and by the time he appeared at the third trial, he found it impossible to deal with his own inconsistencies. It was then that he broke down on the stand and admitted seeing a third party at the scene of the shooting. But even at my first trial, his testimony was too vague and inconsistent to be taken seriously. The testimony of Henry Greer, a black man, and the next major witness for the prosecution was therefore all important. He was the only person besides Haynes who claimed I had had a gun at the scene of the shooting. Greer was a bus driver for the Alameda Contra Costa transit system in Oakland. According to his testimony, he had been driving his bus along 7th Street shortly after 5 a.m. on the morning of October 28, 1967, when he stopped his vehicle and under its bright lights witnessed the shooting of Frey and Haynes from a distance of about 10 feet or less. Asked by Jensen to identify the gunman, Greer left the stand, walked over to where I sat with my attorneys, and put his hand on my shoulder. When he testified for the first time, on the afternoon of August 7, 1968, a feeling of disgust for him overwhelmed me. He was obviously a bought man who had sold out from terror of the white power structure, and perhaps because the district attorney had promised him a few handouts. My attorneys also had reason to suspect, after investigation, that he was in some kind of trouble with his job or the law, and only by cooperating with the district attorney's office could he get out of his predicament. Yet, as the first trial wore on, my feelings of disgust turned to pity. He was, after all, a brother. As a black, I understood that he was coerced into selling his integrity for survival, and I knew he must have been disgusting to himself. After the first trial, I felt Greer would not be able to live with himself, but when he came back and did it twice again, in the second and third trials, I realized he had been totally destroyed as a person, too corrupt even to feel shame. He was a complete mystery to me. It is an indication of Greer's importance to the prosecution that Charles Gary learned of his existence only on August 1st, 6 days before he appeared on the witness stand. On August 1st, jury selection had been completed, and under the rules of the court, the prosecution was required to give the defense the names and addresses of all the witnesses it intended to call during the trial. It was on this day that Gary first saw Greer's name and learned who he was. During the entire 9 months of preparation for the trial, Jensen had seen to it that Greer was kept completely out of sight and never mentioned. He did not appear before the grand jury. In all the police reports, in all the official statements that were issued covering every detail of the incident, the name of the most important witness to the shooting was withheld. Jensen had carried out his Machiavellian tactics with supreme cunning. Only when it was no longer possible to hide Greer did Gary learn of his identity and that he claimed to have witnessed the incident. At the time my lawyers received the prosecution list with Greer's name on it, they were also given another staggering piece of evidence: a transcript of a recorded conversation between Greer and Police Inspector Frank McConnell, which took place at the Oakland Police Station only 90 minutes after the shooting on October 28. The police had brought Greer to the station house for a statement almost immediately after the incident, and in it he described everything he had allegedly seen. He also identified me as the gunman from my photograph in the police files that Inspector McConnell showed him. When my attorneys read Greer's statement, given to the police while everything was still fresh in his mind, we learned why the police and the prosecution had hidden him away. If Charles Gary had had a chance to talk to him earlier, he would have convinced Greer in a very short time that his eyewitness account of the shooting would never stand up in court. First of all, Greer did not make a statement to the police. His interview at the police station was a classic case of verbal entrapment. The inspector led Greer, who who was not only weak, but also in many instances unsure of everything he had seen, and fed him the questions that would produce answers the police wanted. Whenever Greer hesitated or stopped while trying to remember what he had seen, Inspector McConnell put words in his mouth or suggested the way things had happened. Then Greer would agree. But, serious as this was, some of Greer's most crucial statements were so damaging to the prosecution's case, it seems incredible that Jensen was willing to gamble everything on him as a principal witness. The fact that Greer swore I had a gun in my hand must have affected Jensen's judgments concerning the rest of Greer's testimony. First, in describing the gunman, whom he later identified as me, Greer said he was no taller than 5 feet. Sort of a Pee-wee type, you might call him, were his exact words to Inspector McConnell. Since I am 5 feet 10.5 inches, Greer's impression of my height was wildly inaccurate. He also said I was wearing a black shirt, a light tan jacket, and that I was clean-shaven. The police had kept all the clothing I was wearing that night, and it was a matter of record that I wore a black jacket, a white t-shirt, and had 2 weeks' growth of beard. This was confirmed by a close-up photograph taken by the police when I was lying on the gurney at Kaiser Hospital. Then, too, many of the things Greer said in the transcript were at variance with Officer Haynes's depiction of what took place. Greer told Inspector McConnell that he had first come upon the scene while driving his bus westbound on 7th Street. As he approached Willow Avenue on 7th, directly across from the construction site of a new post office, he said he observed 2 parked police cars and near them 2 policemen and 2 civilians standing in the street. It was Greer's impression that the police were probably giving the 2 civilians a ticket or making a routine check, and so he thought little of it as he continued west to the end of his run. This contradicted the testimony of Haynes, who said that the second passenger, McKinney, had remained in the Volkswagen until after Haynes, was shot.
Thank you for the gifts.
Greer related how he went to the end of his route, turned around, and began his eastbound run back along 7th Street, picking up 3 passengers on his way. When he got back to where the police cars were, he said he arrived at the moment Frey and I were walking toward one of the police cars, with Officer Haynes walking behind us. Haynes had testified that he stayed beside Frey's car as we walked toward the other police car and had not accompanied us. At this point, Greer said, while Frey was walking beside me, I reached into my jacket, pulled out a gun, and fired at Haynes, who was walking behind me.
Really quick, everybody on TikTok, F1's locked and loaded. I already have 2 restrictions. Thank you for the gifts. Thank you for the gifts. But I'm on 2 restrictions right now. So if I get clipped on TikTok, guys, please go follow me on YouTube, AfroTaino88, and we're continuing the book club over there. We're dual live right now. So I got a couple of people in there right now. Salute to everybody on YouTube. Appreciate all the love and support, the real dedication. I appreciate everybody on TikTok, vice versa. Let's get back to it, guys. Keep the F1s locked and loaded because they definitely messing with the algorithm.
Haynes fell to the ground.
Thanks for the gifts. Thanks
By
for the
this
gifts.
time, Greer told McConnell he had stopped the bus about 30 or 40 yards away from us. Then, he continued, Frey and I began wrestling, and he heard a second shot. He reached for the phone in his bus to call the central dispatcher of the transit system, and when he looked again, Frey had fallen on his back, and I was standing over him and firing 3 or 4 more shots at him while he lay on his back on the ground. The next thing he knew, said Greer, I had turned and fled west, and within minutes, people and police were arriving at the scene from every direction. He told Inspector McConnell that he had not seen the second civilian after he first passed the 4 of us on his eastbound trip. During the shooting, the man was nowhere to be seen, according to Greer's testimony. Haynes had testified that McKinney was standing near the curb with his hands in the air. As soon as Gary and my other attorneys read this transcript and received Greer's name and address on August 1st, they tried to get in touch with him. He did not appear at work for the next 6 days. They called his home over and over again, but could never reach him. A recorded message said that the number was out of order. For 6 days, a constant vigil was maintained outside his home. No one was there, and neither he nor any member of his family could be found. Greer had simply disappeared. None of my lawyers laid eyes on Henry Greer until he walked into the courtroom on August 7 to testify for the prosecution. On the afternoon his name had been given to the defense, Greer had been taken into protective custody by the district attorney's office and secretly installed in the Lake Merritt Hotel in downtown Oakland, completely unavailable for questioning by the defense. When Greer finally appeared, Gary had only a matter of hours to prepare his cross-examination on the basis of prosecution testimony. However, he had had 6 days to go over Greer's sworn statement to Inspector McConnell, enough time to discredit totally Greer's statements on the witness stand.
I hope we're all getting a better visual on how the system works, especially when it wants to be able to jam an individual up. They'll go by any means necessary to be able to use the law against the individual. That's why it's important for us to be able to know the law. That's why Huey, made a lot of the Panther structure on how to, combat the law and use the law against the system. This is why we got to know these things.
Unbelievably, Greer changed a lot of his earlier testimony under questioning by Jensen. At this point, the jury had not read the transcript of Greer's sworn statement to Inspector McConnell. And so, when Jensen put Greer on the stand on August 7, the jurors were hearing for the first time Greer's account of the shooting. Jensen handled his testimony very slickly, emphasizing particularly that part in which Greer said, "I pulled a gun from inside my shirt, shot at Haynes, and then shot and killed Frey, standing over him and firing 3 or 4 more shots into his body."
F1.
When Greer walked over and identified me, the jury must have been convinced of my guilt, for Greer was a calm, assured witness. But Jensen made a crucial mistake. He thought he could get away with the inconsistencies between Greer's statements made an hour and a half after the shooting and what Jensen coached him to say on the stand. He had Greer tell the jury that he was less than 10 feet away from the participants in the shooting, whereas in his sworn statement to McConnell, Greer had said he was 30 or 40 yards away. He told the jury in the courtroom that I had reached into my shirt for my gun, but in his original statement, he had said I reached into the pocket of my jacket or coat to get it. Greer testified during the trial that Frey fell forward, face down, while he had told McConnell that Frey fell on his back. On the stand, Greer claimed that the bus lights were shining directly on the scene and he could see plainly, but he had told McConnell that he could not tell how old the gunman was because he had his head down and he couldn't get a good look.
Something's not
aligning.
aligning.
He told Jensen on the stand that I had fled toward the post office construction site, but when McConnell had asked him if that was where I was headed when he had last seen me, Greer said no, that I was running northwest toward a gas station. It took only about 3.5 hours of cross-examination for Charles Gary to demolish Greer's credibility. In his examination of him and in his final summation, Gary showed that there were at least 15 crucial statements in which Greer's 2 sworn testimonies were in conflict. For a while, Gary said to the jury near the end of the trial, "I thought Mr. Greer was making an honest mistake. I really thought that for a long time. But I've now come to the conclusion that this man was either deliberately lying or that he is a psychopath and that he can't be depended upon in relating any kind of facts. As far as Huey Newton is concerned, either choice is deadly."
Listen.
In his cross-examination of Greer, Gary first demonstrated that there had been absolutely no reason for his having been taken into protective custody. Over the strenuous objections of Jensen, who constantly leaped up and called Gary's questions incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial, Gary got Greer to admit that not only had the district attorney's office never told him why he was being taken into custody, but also that Greer himself had always felt perfectly safe, had never been threatened, and had never felt a need for any protection. This was an effective beginning, because it showed the jury that the trial was being conducted by a ruthless prosecutor who had denied the defense lawyers their legal right to question a prospective witness. Then Gary proceeded to develop his masterly strategy to expose Greer's fraudulence. He had him describe all over again in the same words the story he had told the jury for the prosecution. Gary wanted the jury to understand very clearly what was happening. The jury was still unaware of Greer's first statement to McConnell. When Greer had finished, Gary took off. He demonstrated in one instance after another all the discrepancies in Greer's two stories. This is how his cross-examination went at one point. Gary, how was the civilian dressed? Greer, well, sir, he had on a dark jacket and a light shirt. Gary, as a matter of fact, sir, didn't that civilian have on a dark shirt and a light tan jacket? Greer, no, sir. Gary, I want you to think about this before you answer it. I'm going to ask you again. Isn't it a fact that the person you have described as the civilian was a person who had a dark shirt on, a black shirt on, and a light tan jacket? Silence. Gary, a light tan jacket? Greer, no, sir. It was dark. Judge Friedman, what was the answer? Greer, dark. Judge Friedman, dark what? Greer, the outer garment was dark. Gary, how tall was that civilian? Greer, from up in the couch, sir, to look down at an angle like that, I wouldn't dare say, sir. Gary, isn't it a fact that that civilian was under 5 feet? Greer, I do not know, sir. Gary, would you say that that civilian was heavy-set, thin, or otherwise? Greer, I didn't pay that close attention, counselor. Gary, Mr. Greer, you know that you are under oath, do you not? Greer, I do, sir, I do. Jensen, object to that as being argumentative, Your Honor. Gary, Mr. Greer, you made a statement to Inspector McConnell on the 28th day of October 1967 at the hour of 6:30 a.m.? Greer, that's right, sir. Gary, and in that statement, didn't you tell Inspector McConnell that the person that was involved was under 5 feet? Greer, I could have, sir. Gary, did you or did you not say so? Greer, I don't recall making any specific statement, sir, as to that fact, sir. At this point, the court adjourned for the day. Next morning, Thursday, August 8, in the absence of the jury, Gary made 2 motions for a mistrial. The first was based on the evidence that the prosecution had hidden a witness from the defense. We found out for the first time yesterday, said Gary to Judge Friedman, that immediately after these documents were given to us and the list of the witnesses, that the prosecution immediately took this man out of circulation to a point where we did not know where he was, under the guise of so-called protective custody. He was put into the Hotel Merit, and we didn't find this out until he was on the stand yesterday afternoon.
Listen up.
Our motion is based upon the grounds that the prosecution has gone out of its way to circumvent the right and the obligation and the duty of the defense to prepare its case and to present it in a serious case as this one is.
Listen.
I feel hamstrung. I feel tied up, and I am asking the court for relief. Jensen immediately responded that if Gary had wanted to talk to any witness, he should have come to the district attorney's office the following day and talked to him there. I have a right to see the witnesses under my own circumstances and my own conditions.
Right.
I spent hours and hours of investigation time trying to locate this man, and all the time he had him under wraps, Gary replied. Then he went on to present his second motion for a mistrial.
Right.
My second motion is based upon the atmosphere of the courthouse. I feel impelled to call to the court's attention that the entire courthouse, as you walk in through the front door, is permeated and surrounded by deputies of the Alameda County Sheriff's Department
Intimidation.
and other police agencies, making it embarrassing and insulting and has, in my opinion, a direct bearing and effect on the jury itself.
Intimidation.
In this particular case, under these circumstances, I feel impelled to call to the court's attention that we don't feel we can get a fair trial with a jury walking through these same doors with bailiffs finding out who they are and what they are doing in the building, and this kind of atmosphere.
You setting
And
up
for that same reason, I am going...
They're literally setting up the trial for failure. These are scare tactics. These are things that they do to be able to manipulate the situations, to have the psychological warfare, not just on the individual, but also the individuals in the system, to be able to manipulate them to do what you want them to do. Let's get to it.
A motion for mistrial. Judge Friedman. Motion denied. Bring the jury down. With that, the jury returned, and Gary resumed his cross-examination of Henry Greer. Gary, Mr. Greer, isn't it a fact that you first saw this officer and this civilian walking alongside of each other, as you have described it, when your bus was at least 30 to 35 yards from the scene? Greer, I did not, sir. Gary, reading from the transcript. And then I noticed as I approached, I saw the officer walking, one guy towards the second patrol car, and this guy was short, sort of a small-built fellow. He, just as I approached within 30 or 40 yards of it, I noticed the man begins going into his jacket. You gave that answer to Inspector McConnell on that hour of the morning, did you not, sir? Greer, I did, sir. Gary, Mr. Greer, this man was under 5 feet, isn't that right? Would you answer that question either yes or no? Greer, I don't know, Counselor. Gary, reading from the transcript. Question, and how tall would you say he was?
Huey's a tall
Answer,
man.
No more than 5 feet. Question, very short? Answer, very short. You gave that answer, did you not, at the time? Greer, I did. Gary, Mr. Greer, how much did this man weigh? Greer, I don't know. Gary, in your estimation? Greer, I don't know, Counselor. Gary, reading from the transcript. Question, about how much would you say he weighed? Answer, 125. Did you give that answer to that question? Greer, I could have, Counselor.
Yo, really quick, just to give you guys I weigh 125 pounds, okay? And I'm 5'8", 5'8.5" on a good day. You know what I'm saying? So imagine what he's describing. Somebody almost 8 inches shorter than me with the same weight that I weigh. That's a very little individual. Just saying.
Gary, was this fellow, this man that you saw on that morning, was this fellow a husky fellow or a thin person or a medium person or what? Greer, medium, I would say. Gary, as a matter of fact, the person you have described was a little pee-wee fellow, isn't that right? Greer, he was not, sir. Gary, reading from the transcript. Question, was he heavy, husky? Answer, no. Question, slender? Answer, sort of pee-wee type fellow you might call him. Isn't that right? That is what you said? Greer, I could have, Counselor. Gary, that is what you did say, isn't it, sir? Greer, possibly, yes. I could have said that, yes, sir. Gary, not possibly. That is exactly what you did say, isn't it, sir?
Facts.
Greer, as I said before, Counselor, without any mistake, I could have. Gary, it was the truth, wasn't it, sir? Greer, it was, sir. After this, and while Jensen registered his disapproval, Gary read to the jury the entire transcript of Greer's statement to Inspector McConnell.
Yeah, he picked it
There
apart.
could be no question in the jurors' minds then that something was suspicious, if not rotten, about the prosecution's star witness. Gary's most dramatic refutation of Greer's testimony, and the one that went to the heart of the matter, came during his final summary for the defense.
Really quick, everybody, we got about 21 minutes left of this chapter. Let's end this chapter out with a bang on both platforms. Again, I'm restricted on TikTok, so every tap helps. Let's tap the screen and share this live. Again, let's shake up the algorithm on TikTok. Hold on, I can't even see my goals right now. What it says, we had 11K. Let's get it up to 15K by the end of this live. And on YouTube, it really doesn't tell me how many taps I get. So I guess just keep tapping, guys. Let's keep it going. Tap that screen, share this live. 20 minutes.
Over to the table in the courtroom where all the evidence for the trial was on display and picked up the black leather jacket I had been wearing on October 28. Then he picked up Haynes's .38 revolver and walked over to the jury box. Standing before the jurors, he quoted Greer's original statement that I had gone into my jacket or coat pocket and pulled out a gun. The gun that the prosecution claimed I had hidden, a .38 pistol, could not have been much smaller than Haynes's revolver, Gary said, as he put the gun into the jacket pocket. It immediately fell out. He put it into the other pocket, and it fell out again. He tried putting the gun in the pockets several times, and each time it fell out. The pocket was too small to hold it. He reminded the jury again of Greer's statement. "And if this isn't a diabolical lie," he said, "then I don't know what a lie is. That's the reason that he changed it from his coat to his shirt. Could it be doctored in any more fashionable way? Try it. This is a shallow pocket. It's about 3½ inches deep. That's why his testimony was changed. And it was changed with the condemnation and the knowledge of the prosecution in this case, to get a conviction." On Monday morning, August 12, Del Ross, accompanied by his own lawyer, arrived at court to testify for the prosecution. At this point, Jensen needed him desperately. The first two major witnesses, Haynes and Greer, had not been as strong as he had hoped. Ross was his last chance. Del Ross had testified before the grand jury in November 1967 that right after the shooting I had jumped into his car with another man and forced him at gunpoint to flee the scene. He was the second person to claim I had had a gun in my hand. The kidnapping charge was important too, since it demonstrated that I knew I had committed a crime and was using desperado tactics to escape. Ross had told the grand jury that I had jumped into the back seat of his car and my companion had gotten into the front. At first, he said, he had refused to drive us to the corner of 32nd and Chestnut as we requested, but when I pulled a gun on him, he complied. He testified that I had said to him, "I just shot two dudes, and I'd have kept shooting if my gun hadn't jammed." When a picture of me was shown to him, Ross identified me as the man with the gun. When Jensen put him on the stand on August 12, he had no reason to suspect that Ross would not repeat all his grand jury testimony. Ross answered his first few questions about where he lived, where he had owned a car in October 1967, what make it was, etc., etc. But when Jensen asked him where he had been at 5 o'clock on the morning of October 28, Ross would not tell him. "I refused to answer on the grounds it would tend to incriminate me," he said. Jensen could not believe his ears. He asked the court reporter to read the answer back to him, as if to reassure himself of what he had just heard. Ross was a prosecution witness. Moreover, he was a victim, not a defendant, and victims do not take the Fifth Amendment. When Ross persisted in refusing to answer, Jensen became furious. From his point of view, Ross's insistence on not answering could damage his case seriously and result in bad publicity. It would look as if something fishy was going on, which of course it was, and put the district attorney's office in an unfavorable light.
Listen.
He appealed to Judge Friedman, asking that the witness be obligated to respond to his questions, pointing out that he had already testified fully on the case before the grand jury 9 months before. At this point, the judge ordered the jury to retire from the courtroom. Ross's lawyer argued that Ross was making a personal claim for his own protection under the Fifth Amendment. He pointed out that questions put to Ross during the trial might well go beyond the factual answers he had given to the grand jury and lead to further questions that could incriminate him. Ross's lawyer suggested that Ross perhaps knew more about what had happened on the morning of October 28 than he had told the grand jury. Here was a dilemma for both prosecutor and judge. Judge Friedman responded by cutting short the proceedings for that day. The next day, he granted Ross immunity and told him he could not be prosecuted for anything that arose out of his testimony, except perjury or contempt for failing to answer questions directed at him. Now, Ross had to answer Jensen's questions and could no longer invoke the Fifth Amendment. But when the prosecutor began all over again and asked the same question Ross had refused to answer the previous day, where he had been at 5 a.m. on October 28, 1967, Ross again refused to answer on the grounds that it would incriminate him. The judge became totally exasperated and told him that he must now answer the questions since he had immunity. Otherwise, he would go to jail for contempt. Ross just sat there stolidly, refusing to go on. Just as Judge Friedman was preparing to sentence him for contempt, Jensen suddenly realized what he could do with this intransigent witness in order to save the day for the prosecution.
Listen.
Mr. Ross, he asked him, do you remember what happened on the morning of October 28, 1967? Ross stalled. Judge Friedman was quick to interject. If you don't remember what happened that morning, he said, why, you should say you don't remember. The court does not desire to force you into anything. Is it perhaps that you don't remember what happened that morning? Ross agreed that he couldn't remember. It was incredible to see the way the judge aided Jensen.
I was just about to say that. You didn't see how the judge guided the individual just to be able to save him from that setup?
What they planned to do was clear. The judge chose to point out that a witness cannot be punished for having a faulty memory. And so the prosecution was going to help Ross remember by reading back to him all his grand jury testimony, which ordinarily is never allowed as evidence in a trial. Charles Gary protested strongly, but Judge Friedman was adamant. Jensen read all Ross's testimony back to him in front of the jury, and it went into the official record of the trial. Never was Judge Friedman's bias in favor of Jensen more blatantly obvious than in his dealings with Del Ross as a witness. It was typical of the arbitrary way the trial was conducted. When their man would not testify because of self-incrimination, they gave him immunity so that anything he said could not be used against him. Then the judge actually coaxed Ross into saying he could not remember what he had said before the grand jury, so that the prosecution had an excuse to read his testimony into the transcript.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. He's starting to sound like Woody from the YSL case. Now, I don't recall. I don't remember. I don't recall. I don't remember.
On the other hand, when our man, Gene McKinney, refused to testify 12 days later because of self-incrimination, they did not offer him immunity or coax him in any way. They just threw him into jail. The police had already exonerated McKinney of any involvement in the incident, but they still would not offer him immunity to protect himself. This was the only time that the contradiction between justice and what the judge and prosecution were doing came out in open court. Their people got immunity when they knew their testimony would incriminate them. Our people, who had been exonerated, but who did not trust the system anyway, got tossed into jail. The whole trial was nothing but a big charade to get me railroaded into the gas chamber. But all their chicanery to get Del Ross's testimony came to nothing in the end, because Charles Gary had called the last trump. 2 weeks before the trial, he had interviewed Ross in his office and taped the conversation, during the course of which Ross admitted that he had lied to the grand jury. He had gone along with the authorities, he said, because they had warrants out on him for parking violations, and he was afraid of them. Ross told Gary in his interview that I did not have a gun that night, that I was barely conscious and had said nothing at all to him. Of course, when Gary got up to cross-examine him during the trial, Ross could not remember this interview either, so Gary played the whole tape in court, over Jensen's vehement objections. As a result, the kidnapping charge against me was dropped for lack of evidence, and I was now being tried on 3 counts instead of 4. Ross's appearance as a witness for the prosecution had been a complete failure. Yet he was brought back for my second and third trials, and both times he repudiated his position during the first trial. Despite this, I felt no anger toward him. Like Greer, he was a crushed and broken man, pathetically terrified of the power of the state. I felt more angry at the prosecution for using him as a dupe of the state than against Ross, who could not defend himself.
Listen.
Ross was the last important witness that Jensen produced, and after he appeared, the prosecution rested its case. In any trial, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution to establish beyond reasonable doubt the evidence of guilt. Jensen had not achieved this. Many of his accusations were made through implication and innuendo, not facts. Despite his single-minded determination to place me at the scene with a gun in my hand, a lot of his evidence had backfired in ways he had not anticipated. In addition to weaknesses in the testimony of both Greer and Haynes, and the fact that their two stories did not jibe at crucial points, there were a number of serious flaws and omissions in the prosecutor's case. Jensen never dealt satisfactorily with the shooting. For instance, the location of the two 9mm casings that were found at the scene by police officers. Jensen had suggested throughout the trial that these casings, which did not match police guns, belonged to the .38 revolver I allegedly carried that night. The casings were found lying 20 to 25 feet apart, one between the two police vehicles and one near the rear left fender of Haynes's car, right where Frey was shot. Since both Haynes's and Greer's testimony coincided in stating that Frey and I had walked to the back of Haynes's car and that no shooting had occurred until we reached this point, how could the second casing have gotten 25 feet away? I could not have been in two places at once.
Listen.
This was an insurmountable puzzle in the prosecution argument. The only possible solution seems to be that a third person was firing at the scene, and the prosecution had totally excluded this possibility since it wanted only one assailant, me. Then, too, my lawyers found the police tapes from that morning very mystifying. They carefully went over the transcript of all the police conversations that were recorded between the police cars at the scene and radio dispatch in the police administration building. The tapes began with a request from Officer Frey just after he had stopped me shortly before 5 a.m. The request was for information about me and the car I was driving. They continued through all the communications that took place after other police cars arrived at the scene following the shooting. In analyzing the messages that passed between radio dispatch and the patrol car radios, my lawyers found indications that the police dispatcher in the administration building was sending out information to other police in the Oakland area that was not being radioed in by the police at the scene. This suggested that either the tapes were tampered with or that witnesses were phoning in accounts of the shooting and giving descriptions that the police at the scene did not have.
Listen.
For instance, the dispatcher assumed that I was connected with the crime since Frey had asked information about me before he was shot, and so he sent out a bulletin about 5:15 a.m. describing me as the suspect and stating that I was wearing a tan jacket. Half an hour later, he inexplicably sent out another bulletin that said I was wearing dark clothing. There had been no incoming police radio message on the tape to tell him this, and no indication of how he got this information. How did he learn that I was wearing dark clothing? Henry Greer, too, had mentioned in his interview with Inspector McConnell a Pee-wee type wearing a tan jacket. Was there a third person answering this description at the scene? Throughout the trial, Jensen never allowed this possibility to be suggested to the jury, even though the police had interviewed witnesses who had heard the shots and arrived at the scene seconds after the shooting. My lawyers even suspect that a number of people in the area were close and had witnessed the incident. One woman, a black prostitute, told the police that she had seen 3 men running away in the direction of the gas station at the corner of 7th Street and Willow Avenue.
F1.
Another witness, a young man, told the police that he had seen 2 cars speeding away north on 7th Street. Jensen never called these people to testify because he wanted to create the impression that I was the only person who could possibly have killed Frey. Yet the accounts of others who were there, and later Haynes's own admission at my third trial that there had been a third person present, contradicted his theory. Another piece of evidence that Jensen found hard to dismiss was the law book I was carrying when Frey ordered me to the back of Haynes's car. Charles Gary pointed out that I could not very well have carried a gun and a law book in my right hand at the same time. But even more crucial was my reason for carrying it. Reading to the police from law books was the only defense I had in case of unlawful arrest. I had done it countless times in the past, and there are hundreds of people in the black community who have seen me do it and can testify that it was my common practice. I carried it again on the morning of October 28 to read the law to Officer Frey. It was an action that Jensen could not distort for his own ends. Perhaps Jensen's most grievous and callous omission during the entire trial was his failure to point out that a vital word in the transcript of Greer's conversation with Inspector McConnell had been changed.
5 minutes
left. It was
left.
only by accident that Charles Gary discovered that this word had been incorrectly transcribed by a typist in the district attorney's office from the tape that Inspector McConnell had made with Greer. And yet this one word was so important that it called into doubt Greer's identification of me from the picture McConnell showed him at police headquarters. To make matters worse, Gary discovered this error only after the trial proper was over and the jury had been out deliberating the verdict for a day. On September 5th, the jury requested to see the transcript, and Judge Friedman called Gary and Jensen into his chambers to ask them for a copy. There was no court copy. The trial clerk had forgotten to acquire one as evidence, and Charles Gary had lent his only copy to someone else. So Jensen went to get his and came back with the original working copy of the transcription. As Gary quickly looked through it, he paused in disbelief over a section of Greer's testimony. There, over the crucial word, was a handwritten correction, completely reversing the meaning of the sentence. This section read, Question: About how old? Answer: I couldn't say because I had only my lights on. I did get a clear view of his face, but because he had his head kind of down facing the headlights of the coach and I couldn't get a good look. Over the word did, someone had written in the correct word, didn't. But throughout the trial, Jensen, knowing that this issue was crucial, had neglected to inform Gary, the jury, and the court that there was a question in the transcript of how clearly Greer had been able to see. Indeed, Jensen's contention was that Greer had gotten a good look and was therefore in a position to identify that person as me. As long as there was the slightest doubt in his mind about whether the word was did or didn't, he had a moral obligation to inform the court and the defense counsel, and it was an absolute matter of conscience that he listen again to the tape to see what the word actually was.
Listen.
He never bothered. In this important matter, and in all the other dubious issues, the position of the bullet casings, the police tapes, the hiding of Greer, the keeping of important witnesses off the stand, the changing of Greer's original testimony, Lowell Jensen proved less than honorable. It is the prosecutor's job to convict a guilty man, not an innocent one. And in my case, Jensen had many reasons to believe I was innocent. He chose to ignore them all. When the prosecution rested its case, Charles Gary, on the morning of August 19, moved for another mistrial. He based his motion on the fact that it was impossible for me to receive a fair trial in Oakland because of the atmosphere of hatred, violence, and controversy. As proof of this, he read to the court samples of hate mail that he and I had been receiving. One of the letters was from 4 retired Marines who said they had known Frey. The letter stated that neither Gary nor I would be alive 10 days after the trial was over, no matter what the verdict. Another letter was signed KKK and read, nigger lover. I guess you feel that the murdering coon's gonna get off because the jury and witnesses have all been intimidated to the extent that no one dares convict.
F1.
I hope he will be gunned down in the streets by some friends of the poor policeman he killed. The Black Panthers parade all over the place, and I don't see why the KKK and American Nazi parties couldn't do the same.
Listen.
It is supposed to be a free country for everybody. It is too bad we ever stopped lynching. At least the damn niggers knew their place in those days and didn't cause any trouble.
F1.
I remember reading about one time they strung up some coons and pulled out pieces of their flesh with corkscrews. That must have been a lot of fun. I wish I had been there to take part in the good work. I hope this race war that we are having starts right away. We outnumber the blacks 10-1, so we know who will win. And a lot of damn nigger lovers will be laying right there beside them. I wish Hitler had won, and then we could have kicked off the shinnies and started in on the coons.
Ooh, and that's the way that chapter ended, guys. Listen, I really appreciate everybody. I hope we're getting a better understanding to see how the system actually works from a perspective of being incarcerated, from, how from literally the stop all the way through the trial, and just see the different tactics, the propaganda, just the ways they try to manipulate the situations. And, luckily for Huey, he knew a lot of his rights. That's what actually, in my opinion, saved him from having, the death penalty implemented on him, and for him to be able to win that trial. But that was part 1 of the trial. Part 2 of the trial is another hour long. So we're going to pick this up where we left off. For everybody on TikTok, don't forget, go follow me on YouTube. We're live on YouTube at the same exact time right now. So if you want to be able to recap what we just went over, and even the beginning chapters that we started yesterday, or even some of the other books that we went over, everything is on YouTube, AfroTaino 88. Don't forget to support the Young Lords Back to Borinquen Project. We will be in Yabucoa, Puerto Rico at the Marcos Sanchez Community Center in Yabucoa, Puerto Rico. The Marcos Sanchez Community Center was a school that got closed down due to lack of funds and resources, so the community decided to take it over and allocate it for emergency purposes, and also for community gatherings. So if you guys want to help, support, volunteer, come down, shoot the shit, whatever you guys want, reach out to me, hit the GoFundMe, link is in the bio on TikTok, and I'm gonna leave you guys with that. Salute the area. And what I really liked today, I had about the even balance between TikTok and YouTube all day today. It's been fluctuating, but I appreciate that everybody's going back and forth. And again, I got 2 restrictions today, so if you can see, I might be getting clipped off of TikToks for certain books. It's happened to me before. I did Angela Davis, Prison Obsoletes. I got put on timeout for like 2.5 weeks or something like that. I've done other books that they put me on timeout for. But this is why we're on YouTube at the same time, guys, to be able to preserve that knowledge and education, and to be able to stop allowing individuals from hindering us from educating our people. Again, I'm not a teacher. I'm just an individual who acquires information that loves to share it with my people. And when I say my people, all people who come from all oppressed situations and all oppressed classes. But I'm gonna catch you guys later. Like I always tell you guys, stay positive and productive. Don't allow anybody else to dictate the rest of your day. If you gotta walk through a door and close that shit behind you, close that shit, lock that shit, and keep it pushing. Salute to you guys. Stay positive, and I'm gonna catch you guys later. 1.